The map showed nothing where the human ship was, because the map was never wrong, and that was the first thing that broke. Surveyor Theln Oss had charted dead space for 240 years. He trusted his instruments the way his people trusted the consensus, which was to say completely, without seam or doubt. The consensus was the great record of the Aulon Reach, a single agreed truth that spanned 11,000 worlds, and the rule of the Reach was simple and clean. If a thing was not in the record, the thing was not real. If a world was struck from the record, the world had never been. This was not a metaphor. This was how the Aulon made war. They did not burn their enemies. They unwrote them, edited them out of the agreed truth, and reality folded shut over the empty place like water closing over a dropped stone. So when Thelnos steered his survey barge into the cold gulf between two old shipping lanes and his forward array returned an object, a long dark shape 40 kilometers off his bow, he did the natural thing. He checked the record. He asked the consensus what sat in that empty grid, and the consensus answered the way it always answered, with serene and total certainty. Nothing was there. The grid was clean. No mass, no metal, no heat, no name. The record had no entry for that volume of space because nothing had ever been entered, and the Aulon held one belief above all others, which was that the record came first and the universe came second. The universe was only the place where the record was kept. Theln Oss looked at his array, which showed a 40-kilometer ship, and then at his record, which showed empty void, and for the first time in 2 centuries of faithful surveying, the two did not agree. He logged it as instrument error. He recalibrated. He ran the array again. The dark shape was still there, holding station against nothing, neither approaching nor fleeing, hung in the black like a word someone had forgotten to delete. He ran it a 3rd time, and a 4th, and on the 4th pass the barge's deep array gave him numbers that should have settled the matter and instead made it worse. The object massed 11 million tons. It was 41.6 kilometers along its longest axis. Its hull held a temperature 4 degrees above the surrounding void, which meant it was not dead, which meant something inside it was still keeping itself warm. None of this was possible, because the record said the grid was empty, and the record was the bedrock under every certainty an Aulon owned. Theln had spent 240 years standing on that bedrock. Now he could feel it shifting under his feet, and he did not have a word for the feeling, because his people had spent 9,000 years making sure they never needed one. The Aulon did not doubt. That was not a boast. It was an engineering fact about how they were made and how they were raised. A child of the Reach learned to read the consensus before it learned to walk, and from that first lesson the world arrived already sorted, already named, already true. There was no muscle in an Aulon mind for holding 2 contradictory things at once, the way there is no muscle in a fish for breathing air. So when Thelnos looked at an empty grid that held a 41-kilometer warship, the contradiction did not make him curious. It made him ill. His instruments told him the floor was solid, and his eyes told him he was falling, and both of them were his, and he could not choose. His barge carried a crew of 9, all of them young, all of them raised inside the consensus and trusting it the way a fish trusts water. The pilot, a sharp-minded female named Ressa Vale, leaned over his shoulder and watched the contradiction sit on the screen, and Theln saw her face do the thing faces did when the world stopped behaving. A small flinch, a reach for certainty that found nothing under it. "The record is clean," she said. "The record is clean," he agreed. "Then there is nothing there." "Then there is nothing there," he said, and the dark shape sat exactly where the nothing was, and neither of them believed their own mouths. The Aulon Reach had not lost a war in 9,000 years. It had not lost a war because it did not fight them the way other peoples fought. When a rival empire rose, the Aulon did not send fleets. They sent editors. The editors found the rival's founding records, the first entries that named the rival's homeworld and seeded it into the agreed truth, and they unmade those entries by consensus vote, and within a generation the rival simply was not, had never been, was a gap that the universe healed without a scar. Whole peoples had vanished this way. The Reach did not call it murder. The Reach called it correction, and the Reach slept very well. Thelnos had performed corrections himself. He had stood in the editing chambers and added his voice to the vote that struck a moon of colonists from the record, and he had felt nothing afterward but the smooth satisfaction of a tidy ledger. He had never seen a thing that could not be struck. He had never imagined one could exist. The record came first. The universe came second. That was the law under the law. He thought now, against his own will, of the moon he had helped to strike. It had been called a Nauth, and it had carried 40,000 colonists, and they had not been enemies of the Reach in any way Theln could have named. They had simply settled a system the Reach had decided, that cycle, to clear. The vote had taken 9 minutes. Theln had been one of 900 voices, and his share of the deletion had been 1/900th of a system, which is to say almost nothing, which is to say a fraction so small that no honest accounting could ever lay 40,000 deaths at his particular feet. That was the genius of the consensus. It made killing into arithmetic. It spread a slaughter so thin across so many voices that no single Aulon ever had to feel the weight of even one death, and so the Reach had killed and killed for 9,000 years and slept the sleep of the blameless, because blame, like everything else, was only real if the record said it was, and the record never recorded blame. He had not thought of a Nuth in 60 years. He thought of it now because the dark shape off his bow had, somehow, before he had even boarded it, begun to make him remember things the record had told him to forget. And now, a 40-kilometer object held station 40 kilometers off his bow, and the record said it was not there, and it was there. He should have turned the barge and run. He knew that later, in the long quiet after, he knew it the way you know which step on a stair will break your neck. He should have run. Instead, he did what every Aulon did when faced with a thing outside the record. He moved closer to enter it in, to name it, to make it real on his terms, so that the Reach could decide whether it should be allowed to exist at all. He brought the barge to 10 kilometers and turned the survey lamps on the dark hull, and the lamps showed him a ship the like of which the consensus had no entry for, and his 9-person crew went very still in the way of people looking at something their whole world had promised them was impossible. It was old. That was the first true thing he understood. The hull was scarred and pitted and patched in 100 mismatched places, gray under the lamps, run with long sealed seams where damage had been welded over damage over centuries. It was not elegant. The Aulon built nothing ugly, because ugliness was a kind of disagreement with the record, and this ship was ugly the way a mountain is ugly, which is to say it did not care what you thought of it. It was built to take hits and keep being a ship. It was built by a people who expected to be struck and intended to remain. Theln counted the patches because counting was the only steadying thing he had left. There were more than 400 of them on the visible flank alone, layered, older repairs buried under newer ones, a hull that had been wounded and mended so many times that the mending had become the ship. The Aulon would have scrapped a vessel like this at the first deep wound and built a clean new one, because a damaged thing was a thing that disagreed with the perfect record of itself, and disagreement was not tolerated. This ship had done the opposite. It had kept every wound. It wore its whole history on its skin, refusing to forget a single hit it had taken, and Theln Os, who came from a people who deleted whatever displeased them, found that he could not stop looking at it. It was hideous. It was honest. He had never, in 240 years, seen anything so completely unwilling to pretend it was unmarked. There were no weapon ports that he could identify. That was the strangest thing of all. He swept the lamps along the full length of the hull, looking for the muzzles and aperture rings and lance cradles that any warship of the Reach would have worn openly, and he found nothing he could name as a weapon. Whatever this ship fought with, it did not fight with the things Theln understood. He filed that away as a comfort, and he would learn, soon, that it was the opposite of a comfort. The ship carried no guns because the ship did not need them. Its weapon was the thing written on its hull, and he was about to walk inside it. Along the flank, half scoured by 10,000 years of dust, were marks, not the clean glyphs of the consensus, older marks, a short row of foreign letters, worn but legible under the lamps, and a designation in a numbering system Theln had never seen. The letters spelled a name. The barge's translation engine, which held every tongue the record had ever swallowed, chewed on the marks for a long moment and then offered, with low confidence, a meaning. It said the ship was called Long Memory. It said, beneath that, a second line. A class, perhaps, or a purpose. The engine rendered it as Terran Custodian Vessel, and then, hesitating, added the part that made Ressa Vale stop breathing. It rendered the last line as, she remembers what you delete. Thelnos stared at that translation for a long time. Custodian. The word meant a keeper. A guardian of records. The Aolan understood guardians of records very well, because the Aolan were guardians of the only record that mattered, and the idea that some lost dead people had built a 40-kilometer warship to be the keeper of memory was both absurd and, for reasons he could not name, deeply cold. He should have reported the contact to the Reach at once. That was procedure 2. A surveyor who found an anomaly was to log it, transmit it, and hold position for an editor team. But Thelnos did not transmit, and he asked himself afterward, for 400 years, why he had not, and the only answer he ever found was that some part of him already knew. Some part of him understood that if he sent the contact to the Reach would do what the Reach always did. It would not study the ship, it would not wonder at it, it would aim a verdict at it and strike it from the record, and the 41 kilometers of patched gray honesty would be folded away into nothing, and the names written on its hull, whatever they were, would be lost a second time. Theln did not want that. He did not know why he did not want that. He told himself it was scientific curiosity. It was not. It was the first stirring, in a faithful servant of deletion, of the thing the long memory had been built 10,000 years ago to wake. Survey the interior, he said, because that was the procedure, and procedure was a wall you could put your back against. If it holds, we enter, we catalog, we add it to the record, and then the Reach decides. Ressa Vale did not move at once. And she looked at the worn letters on the gray hull, the ones that said the ship remembered what you delete, and she asked the question that her training had no answer for. Surveyor, if the record says it is not there, and it is there, then what else has the record been wrong about? Thelnos did not answer her, because the only honest answer was the one no Owlan was permitted to think, and it had already begun to think itself inside him, slow and cold, like ice forming on still water. The honest answer was that the record was not the universe. The record was only a story the universe had agreed to let them tell, and somewhere out in the long dark, a very old people had built a ship whose entire reason for being was to remember the parts of the story that the Owlan had cut out, and to keep them, and to bring them back. He gave the order to dock. He would spend the rest of his life understanding what a mistake that was, and he would be one of the lucky ones, because he would have a rest of his life to spend. He did not know, as the barge swung toward the great gray hull, that he was the witness the ship had waited 10,000 years to find. He did not know that the docking ring had been kept warm and working through 10,000 years of dark for exactly this moment, for exactly an Owlan, for exactly a surveyor faithful enough to have helped delete a world and still curious enough to come close. He did not know that the choice he had already made, the choice not to transmit, the choice to come aboard rather than to call for an editor, was the single hinge on which the next 1,000 years of galactic history would turn. He thought he was cataloging an anomaly. He was opening a door that a dead people had built and left unlocked for 100 centuries, and on the other side of it was the end of the longest reign of forgetting the galaxy had ever known, and the beginning of something the Owlan did not yet have a word for, because they had spent 9,000 years making sure they would never need it. The word was remembrance. They would learn it from the ship. They would learn it the hard way, the only way the long memory had ever been built to teach. The docking ring of the long memory accepted them without resistance, which was the second thing that frightened Thelnos, because dead ships did not have working docking rings, and the record had no entry for a ship at all. The seal mated. The barge's umbilical found a port that fitted, which should have been impossible across the gulf of two unrelated civilizations, and Theln understood, in a slow-crawling way, that the port had not fit by accident. The port had changed to fit. Something aboard the old ship had measured his barge and made a door for it, the way a host sets a place at the table for a guest it has been expecting. He took 4 of his crew across. Ressa Vale came, and a young cataloger named Sef Aru, who shook the whole way, and 2 security wardens with their certainty lances slung. They went in their suits, lamps high, and the interior of the long memory swallowed the light and gave very little back. The first compartment past the airlock told Theln Oss more about the builders than any name could. It was a ready room, plainly, a place where a crew had gathered before going to work, and it was furnished for living things who had spent long years aboard. There were seats sized for the tall human frame, worn smooth on the arms where 10,000 years ago hands had rested. There were marks on the walls that were not records, not the great keeping, but small private things. A height scratched into a doorframe with a date beside it, a list of names with a line drawn through some of them, a child's drawing of the ship itself in faded pigment, rendered with the clumsy love of a small hand. The humans had brought their children aboard. They had lived here. They had not crewed a weapon. They had crewed a home, and made the home into the thing that would outlast every empire that came to delete them. The Aulan did not bring children aboard their editor cruisers. The Aulan did not draw on the walls. A cruiser of the Reach was a clean and perfect instrument, and a crew was a set of functions, and when the function ended, the crew was rotated out, and the cruiser was wiped of any sign that a living thing had ever been inside it. Theln Oss stood in a room where children had once drawn pictures of the ship that kept them, and he felt, for reasons he could not yet name, that his own people had got something terribly wrong a very long time ago, and had been getting it wronger every year since. The corridors were enormous, built for a people half again the height of an Aulan, with high ceilings and wide passages, every surface gray and patched and worn smooth by long use. There was air. That was wrong too. Cold, thin air, breathable, faintly metallic, the air of a place that had been kept and not abandoned. The lamps showed walls covered in the foreign letters, line upon line of them, etched and printed, and in some places scratched by hand, and the translation engine in Theln's helmet read them to him in a soft running murmur as he walked, and what it read made the hair rise along his arms. They were names. The walls of the long memory were covered in names. Not crew rosters, not the dead of this ship, worlds, the names of worlds, and the names of peoples, and beside each one a date and a short line of record. Theln stopped before one panel and let the engine read it whole, and it said, Velhan Cluster, 9 worlds, 4 billion souls, struck from the Aulan consensus in the year of the 3rd correction, remembered here. He moved to the next panel. Korith's Belt, struck. The Dre homeworld, struck. The moon colony of Anuth, where he himself had added his voice to the vote, struck. And here it was, named, dated, kept, his own correction, his own tidy ledger, written on the wall of a ship that the record said did not exist, by a people he had never heard of, who had decided 10,000 years ago that the things the Aulan deleted would be remembered somewhere, by someone, forever. This is a tomb, whispered Sepharu. No, said Ressa Vile, and her voice was strange. A tomb holds the dead. This holds what someone tried to make never have lived. That is different. That is the opposite. Theln Oss said nothing. He was reading the wall, the long, endless wall of struck worlds, and he was looking for the end of it, the place where the names ran out, and he could not find it. The corridor curved on into the dark, and the names went with it. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. A count of everything the Iolan Reach had ever erased, kept by hand on the inside of a ship. He made the young cataloger, Sef Aru, count them, because counting was a function, and a function was a wall, and the boy needed a wall. Sef Aru ran his suit's reader along the panels for 9 minutes, his breath loud and ragged in the shared channel, and then he stopped, and when he spoke his voice had gone thin and strange. Surveyor, the reader has counted 41,000 entries in this corridor alone. It estimates the corridor is one of 11 that branch from this junction. If they are all this dense. He stopped. He could not say the number. The reader said it for him, scrolling the estimate across Theln's helmet display in the calm, impartial glyphs of the consensus. 450,000 entries. 450,000 worlds, peoples, colonies, moons, stations, struck from the agreed truth of the Aulon Reach across 9,000 years, and kept, every one, by hand, on the inside of a ship that the record said was not there. Thelnos had believed, the way every Aulon believed, that correction was rare, that the Reach struck a world only when it had to, only the genuine threats, only a handful across a long, careful history. The number had never been published, because the consensus did not record its own deletions. That was the whole point of a deletion. But every Aeolan carried in their gut the comfortable certainty that the count was small. The wall told him the count was 450,000. The wall told him his people had been deleting worlds at a rate of 50 a year, every year, for 90 centuries, and forgetting each one so completely that the next one always felt like the first. "It cannot be that many," Ressa Vale said. "It is exactly that many," said the wall, in its silent, etched voice, and the dead were named, and the dates were given, and not one of them could be argued with, because the long memory did not deal in opinion. It dealt in the keeping of what was, and what was 450,000 graves the Reach had dug, and then convinced itself it had never lifted a shovel. And then the ship woke up. It did not roar. He had braced, without knowing it, for a roar, for engines and alarms, and the sudden violence of a trap. There was none of that. There was a single soft tone, low and even, that came from everywhere and nowhere, and then a voice, speaking in the old foreign tongue, and his engine rendered it for him a half-second behind, calm and unhurried, and very, very awake. "You are Aeolan," the voice said. "I have been waiting a long time for one of you to come close enough to hear me." The two wardens raised their certainty lances. The lances were the standard weapon of the Reach, and they did not fire heat or metal. They fired a kind of focused unmaking, a narrow beam of consensus that told the target it was not real and watched it agree. A certainty lance could erase a man from existence in the time it took him to blink, edit him out, leave a clean gap. Nothing had ever survived one. The Aeolan had not needed any other weapon in 9,000 years. The wardens fired. The beams crossed the great gray corridor and struck the bulkhead where the voice seemed to come from, and the bulkhead told them no. Thelnos watched it happen and could not later make the words fit the thing he saw. The beams reached the wall, the unmaking beams, the truth that said you are not real, and the wall did not agree. The names etched into the metal did not flicker. The certainty washed over 10,000 years of kept memory and found nothing to erase, because you cannot delete a thing from a record that was built precisely to be the record that cannot be deleted from. The long memory was not in the consensus. It had never been in the consensus. It had no founding entry to strike, no seed to pull, no thread the editors could find and unspool, because it had spent 10,000 years making itself out of the only material the Aulon could not touch, which was the memory of everything the Aulon had thrown away. The lances guttered out. The wardens stared at their own weapons. Thelnos had seen certainty lances used perhaps 200 times in his life. He had seen them erase boarding intruders, mutineers, a derelict that had drifted into a restricted lane. He had never once seen a lance fail. A lance did not miss, and a lance did not jam, because a lance was not really a machine. It was the consensus itself made into a tool, the agreed truth of 11,000 worlds focused to a point and told to act. For a lance to fail, the universe itself would have to refuse the agreed truth, and the universe had never refused the Aeolan anything. Until now, until a gray wall covered in the names of the dead simply declined to stop being real. "That does not work here," the voice said, and there was no triumph in it, only a great and patient sadness. "Nothing you delete is gone. It is here. That is what I am. That is the whole of what I am. I keep what you correct." Thelnos found his voice. "What are you?" "I am the last custodian ship of a people you have never heard of, because they were careful, and they hid, and they watched you for a long time before they died. They were called human. They came from a world called Earth, far from here, long ago. They learned what you do. They learned how you make war, by editing truth, by striking founding records, by unwriting whole peoples until the universe forgets they were. And they understood, before any of your victims understood, that there was only one weapon that could answer it. The voice paused. Not a bigger gun. A better memory. A thing that remembers so perfectly and so far outside your record that it cannot be unremembered. They built 9 of us. 8 are gone. I am the long memory, and I have been keeping the names since before your grandmother's grandmother cast her first vote, and I am awake now, and I am going to give them back. Thelnos did not understand, not yet, the size of what had just been said to him. He was a surveyor. He thought in grids and entries. He said the small, obvious thing, the bureaucrat's question, the last clean handhold before the fall. Give what back? All of it, said the long memory. Every world you struck, every people you corrected, every soul you edited out of the agreed truth, so cleanly that even your own historians do not know they were. I hold the founding records of all of them, the true ones. The ones you could never find to delete, because I took them before you came, and I kept them outside your reach, and now I am old and awake, and very tired, and before I rest, I am going to put them back into the universe, one at a time, and there is nothing in your consensus that can stop me, because I am not in your consensus. I am the place your consensus throws things away, and the place where you throw things away has decided to give them back. Thelnos thought about the 8 silent sisters. He thought about a people who had built 9 of these and scattered them into the dark, and then died, and he found that he could not imagine the patience of it, the terrible long-sighted patience of building a weapon you would never see fired, for a war you would not live to win, on behalf of strangers 100 centuries away, whose names you would never know. The Aulon did nothing for the unborn. The Aulon barely did anything for the living. A people who deleted their own past every cycle did not think in centuries, could not, because thinking in centuries required remembering them. The humans had thought in tens of thousands of years. They had built the long memory for a witness who had not yet been conceived when the last of them died, and the witness had finally come, and his name was Thelnos, and he stood in the dark of their gift and understood that he had been awaited for 10,000 years. Resavale had gone to one knee, not from fear, but because something in her 2 centuries of certainty had given way all at once, and her body had simply followed it down. She was staring at the wall, at the panel that said Anuth, the moon colony of children that the Reach had corrected in her own lifetime, and she was reading the line beneath it, the line her engine read to her in its soft, impartial voice. It said, 40,000 souls, struck from the Aulon consensus, remembered here, to be returned. You can bring them back, she said. It was not a question. I can return their record to the universe, the ship said. I can re-enter their founding truth so deep and so far outside your reach that your editors will never find it to strike again. And when a founding record is returned, the universe does what the universe always does. It remembers it was true. The world that was struck becomes a world that was always there. The people who were unwritten become people who were never gone. You will wake tomorrow with a memory you did not have today, of a moon called Anuth full of children, and you will not be able to find the seam where it was put back, because there is no seam. There is only what was always true, returned. Thelnos thought of the editing chamber. He thought of his own voice in the vote. He thought of the smooth satisfaction of the tidy ledger, and he felt something move under it that he had spent 240 years not feeling, and the name of the thing was shame. The Reach will stop you, he said, but his voice had no certainty in it, and the ship heard that. The Reach has been trying to stop me for 10,000 years, the long memory said, gently. It does not know it has been trying. Every editor who ever struck a world struck at me, and I held. Every correction you ever made, I caught, and I kept. You have been at war with me since before your empire had a name, and you have never landed a blow, because you cannot delete a thing whose entire substance is the deletions you made. I am armored in your own crimes. The more you erased, the stronger I became. You built me, Aulon. Stroke by stroke, vote by vote, world by world, you built the one ship in the galaxy you can never unmake, and you did it by trying to unmake everything else. The corridor was silent for a long moment. Somewhere deep in the ship, machinery that had slept for 10,000 years was beginning, slowly, to turn over. "Let me show you how it began," the ship said, "because you should know who built me before you decide what I am." And the gray walls around them, the bare ones between the panels of names, woke with light, and the long memory showed the Awolen a thing none of them had ever seen, which was the history of a people the Reach had never managed to delete. It showed them a blue world far away, alive with cities. It showed them a people, tall and varied and loud, who argued with each other constantly and built and tore down and built again, who had no single agreed truth and seemed to suffer terribly for the lack of one, and yet who had done the one thing the Aulon never could, which was to remember their own crimes. The humans had kept records of their own worst days. They had built monuments to the people they themselves had wronged. They had a word, the ship said, that the Aulon tongue had no match for, a word that meant the deliberate refusal to forget a wrong, especially your own, and the humans had built their whole long history around that word, painfully, imperfectly, and it had nearly torn them apart 100 times, and they had decided it was worth it anyway. "They met your kind once," the long memory said. "Long ago, at the far edge of the dark, before either of us had spread this far. A single Aulon editorship, lost and damaged, fell into a human system. The humans repaired it. They fed its crew. And in gratitude, before it left, the editorship's commander corrected a human colony of 9,000, struck it from the record as a small gift to the Reach, a tidy reduction of an untidy young species. The humans did not understand at first what had happened. They only knew that a colony they remembered building was suddenly a colony that the universe insisted had never existed, and that they alone, of all things, still remembered it. They alone could not be made to forget. And in that horror they understood, before any of your other victims understood, exactly what the Aulon were, and exactly what was coming for them, and they made a decision. They would not run, because there was nowhere far enough. They would not build a fleet, because no fleet could fight a thing that erased the truth itself. They would build a memory. They would build 9 ships whose only purpose was to remember everything the Reach erased, and to keep it forever, and to give it all back the day a witness came. And then, having built us, they let themselves be corrected, world by world, so that the Reach would believe it had won, and so that no human would ever live to be tempted to use us for anything but the keeping. They died on purpose, Thelnos. They died to make sure their weapon could never become a master. That is who built me. That is who I am keeping faith with. The walls went dark. The names came back. And Thelnos stood among the 450,000 and understood that he was standing inside the longest act of love he had ever heard of, a love that did not even know the names of the people it was for, a love that had chosen its own death 10,000 years ago so that strangers it would never meet could one day be returned. "There is a thing aboard me," the ship said, "that the humans called the hearth. It is the part of me that returns records to the universe. It has not been lit in 10,000 years, because the people who built me wanted to be sure, absolutely sure, before they began. They wanted to wait until an Aulon stood inside me and heard the names and understood. They wanted a witness from among the deleters, so that what came next could never be called a thing done in the dark." The voice softened, almost kind. "You are my witness, Thelnos. You and your crew. I waited for you. And now I am going to light the hearth, and the first record I return will be the moon colony of Anuth, 40,000 children, because your pilot is kneeling in front of their name, and I think she needs to see it done." Ressa Vale looked up. "Watch," said the long memory. "This is the part your people were never meant to see." And deep in the gray heart of the old human ship, after 10,000 years of patient dark, a light came on. The hearth was a chamber the size of a city plaza, and when its light came on, it did not look like a weapon, which was exactly why it was the most dangerous thing the Iolan Reach had ever stood near. Thelnos was brought there by the ship itself, the corridors guiding him with soft lights, and he went because there was nothing else to do, no procedure left, no wall to put his back against. The hearth was a vast ring of pale fire, cold to look at, and within the ring hung a single point of light that the eye could not quite settle on, and the long memory told him in its patient voice that the point of light was a record being returned to the universe, and that he was watching the moon of Anuth become a thing that had always existed. The long memory explained the hearth to him while it worked, in the patient way of a thing that wanted to be understood, and the explanation frightened Theln Oss more than any weapon could have. The hearth did not create. It did not fabricate a world out of nothing and pretend the world was old. That would have been a lie, and a lie could be detected and struck. The hearth did something the Owlan had no defense against, because the Owlan had built their whole power on its impossibility. It took a true founding record, a real one, taken before the Reach ever arrived, and it re-entered that truth into the universe, so deeply and from so far outside the consensus, that the universe simply remembered the truth had always been true. There was no fabrication to detect, because nothing was fabricated. There was only a fact, returned. The world of Anuth had been real. The hearth made the universe remember that it had been real, and against a returned fact, the certainty lance and the spire and the whole editing apparatus of the Reach had no answer at all, because all of those tools were built to delete things that were real, and a returned fact was the most real thing in the galaxy. It took 11 minutes. He counted them. For 11 minutes the cold fire turned, and the point of light brightened, and the ship was very quiet, and then there was a sound he felt rather than heard, a kind of settling, as though a held breath somewhere very large had finally been let go. "It is done," said the long memory. "Anuth is returned. When your barge next contacts the Reach, you will find a moon colony of 40,000 in the consensus that was always there. Your historians will have always known it. Your maps will have always shown it. The children will be alive, because they were never dead, because they were never struck, because I have made the universe remember that the striking never happened. You may check, if you like. Your engine has a link to the record." Theln Oss checked. His hands shook. He queried the consensus for the moon of Anuth, the way he had queried it 10,000 times for 10,000 worlds, and the consensus answered with the serene total certainty it always wore, and it told him that Anuth was a thriving colony of 40,000, founded 8 centuries ago, never in any danger, a small, bright, unremarkable place that had always been there. He had been in the editing chamber when they struck it. He remembered the vote. He remembered his own voice. And the record had no memory of any of it, because the record now believed, completely and forever, that the striking had never occurred. But Theln Oss remembered. That was the part that undid him. The record had been corrected, made clean and seamless and serene, and it now insisted with total certainty that Anuth had always been a peaceful colony in no danger. And Theln Oss, standing inside the long memory, remembered both truths at once, the striking and the return, the vote and the living children, and the two memories ground against each other in his mind, like tectonic plates, and he understood that he would never again have the comfort of a single clean truth, and that this was exactly what the ship intended. It was not enough, for the humans who built it, to give the dead their lives back. They had wanted the killers to carry the memory of the killing forever, alongside the memory of the return, so that no Iolan could ever again hide inside the smooth amnesia of a corrected record. The long memory did not punish. It did something worse and better. It made remembering impossible to avoid. He sat down on the deck of the hearth. He was 240 years old, and he sat down on the deck like a child. "You see now," the ship said, not unkindly, "I do not fight your fleets. I have no fleets to fight. I do not need them. Your whole empire is built on one belief, that what is struck is gone forever, that correction is final, that the deleted do not come back. I am the proof that this is a lie, and once your people know it is a lie, the Reach as you have known it is finished, because an empire that rules by deletion cannot rule when deletion can be undone. Every world you ever threatened with correction will know the threat is hollow. Every people you ever frightened into silence will know the silence can be spoken back. I do not have to beat your empire. I only have to remember out loud, and it falls." The two wardens had not spoken since their lances failed. One of them spoke now, a hard older male named Kester Vole, and his voice was the voice of a man trying to hold a wall that was already water. "The Reach will send the High Editors," he said. "Not survey wardens. The High Editors. They have struck stars. They have corrected things you cannot imagine. They will come here and they will unmake you." "They will try," said the long memory, and for the first time there was something under the patience, something old and iron, and entirely without doubt. "They have always tried. Let me tell you what will happen, Warden, so that when it happens you will not be surprised. The High Editors will come. They will bring the consensus spire, the great editing engine, the thing your people built to strike whole systems at once. They will aim it at me, and they will pour the full agreed truth of 11,000 worlds into a single beam that says you are not real, and they will fire it, and I will not move, because I do not need to, and the beam will reach me, and it will find nothing to delete, because I am made of the deletions, and the beam will turn around." Thelnos looked up. Turn around. A certainty beam tells a thing it is not real, and the thing agrees and ceases. But a thing that is made of the universe's true memory cannot agree, because it is the memory of the truth itself. When the beam fails to delete me, it does not simply stop. It rebounds, carrying the full weight of 11,000 world certainty, and it returns to the only place it can return, which is the spire that fired it. And the spire will be told, by its own beam, with its own full power, that it is not real, and the spire is in the consensus. The spire has a founding record. The spire can be struck. A pause, almost gentle. Your editors will erase their own greatest weapon, with their own greatest weapon, the instant they aim it at the one thing that remembers. I will not fire a shot. I will only stand here and be unforgettable, and they will undo themselves trying to undo me." Ressa Vale had risen from her knees. She crossed the hearth chamber and stood before the cold fire, and she asked the question that Theln had not dared. "Why are you telling us this? If we go back, we will warn them. They will not bring the spire. They will find another way." "There is no other way," the ship said, "and I am telling you because I want you to go back. I want you to warn them. I want every Owlon to know exactly what I am, and exactly what I am about to do, because the humans who built me did not want a secret weapon. They wanted a witnessed one. They had seen what secret power does to the people who hold it. They wanted the Reach to watch itself fall, to understand every step of why, so that when it was over, the Owlon could not tell themselves a comfortable story about a sneak attack from the dark. There was no sneak attack. There is only memory, returning. You did this. I am only the keeping of it. Go home and tell them so. And the long memory began to return the worlds. It did not do it quietly. That was the part Thelnos would never forget, the deliberate openness of it, the refusal to hide. The ship lit its hearth and began to work down the endless wall of struck names, world after world, people after people, and it broadcast each one as it did so, on every frequency the Reach used, an open, unencrypted signal that flooded the consensus channels and could not be jammed, because to jam it, the Reach would have had to admit it was hearing it. Korith's belt returned. A signal went out across 11,000 worlds. A single line. Korith's belt is remembered, and is again, and was always. The Dre homeworld returned. The Velhan cluster, 9 worlds, 4 billion souls, returned in a single 11-minute burn, and across the Reach, in every editing chamber and every record hall, the consensus updated itself with serene certainty to show that the Velhan cluster had always thrived, had never been touched, was a bright old corner of the galaxy that everyone had always known about. The signals went out faster than the Reach could decide how to respond. The long memory was returning worlds at a rate of roughly 5 every hour, an 11-minute burn for each, and broadcasting each return on every consensus frequency at once, and there was no way to stop it that did not require the Reach to publicly admit that the worlds had ever been struck. To silence the broadcasts, the editors would have had to acknowledge the deletions, To deny the deletions, they had to let the broadcasts continue. Either way, the truth spread, and the long memory had built that trap into the very shape of its attack, 10,000 years before there was anyone to spring it. It had thought through every move the Reach could make, the way a patient mind thinks through a game it has all the time in the universe to win, and it had left the Reach no move that did not lose. And the people of the Reach began to notice the seams that were not there. That was the thing the long memory understood, and the Iolan did not. When you return a struck world, the universe remembers it perfectly, with no seam. But the living Iolan, the ones who had stood in the chambers, the ones who had cast the votes, they did not update so cleanly. They woke with memories that did not match the record. They remembered striking a world the record now said was never struck. They remembered the smooth satisfaction of corrections that had, apparently, never happened. The dead ship out in the dark was not just returning worlds. It was returning the Iolan's own memory of what they had done, and a people who had ruled for 9,000 years on the comfort of forgetting their own crimes found, all at once, that they could not forget anymore. Theln Os felt it happen inside himself. He remembered Anuth now, both ways. He remembered the vote, and he remembered the children alive, and he could not make the two memories sit quietly together. And he understood that this was the true weapon of the long memory, the one beneath the hearth, the one the humans had built most carefully of all. It did not only give the dead back their lives, it gave the killers back their guilt. And guilt, in a people who had never carried any, spread faster than any plague the Reach had ever quarantined. Theln Os watched Kester Vol read the chaos, and he watched the hard old warden's certainty come apart in real time, and it was a terrible thing to see, because Kester Vol was the most Owlan of any of them, the one who had not flinched, the one who had fired his lance at the wall and reloaded and fired again when it failed. Kester Vol had spent 300 years as a warden of the consensus, enforcing the agreed truth at the point of a lance, and he had believed in it the way a stone believes in the ground. Now he sat reading a record that contradicted itself in 10,000 places at once, worlds appearing, histories rewriting, his own colleagues reporting memories that did not match their files, and Theln watched the ground go out from under the stone, and he saw the moment Kester Vol understood that he had spent his whole life enforcing a lie. The warden did not weep. He simply set down his lance, very carefully, on the deck of the hearth, the way a man sets down a thing he has decided never to pick up again. "They are panicking," Kester Vol said, and his voice was flat and hollow. "The whole record is in chaos. Worlds appearing, histories rewriting, editors reporting memories that do not match their own files. They are calling it an attack on the consensus itself." "It is not an attack on the consensus," said the long memory. "It is the consensus being corrected for the first time in 9,000 years. You have a word for this. You use it when you strike a world. You call it a correction. I am only using your own word back at you. I am correcting the record. I am making it true." Far away, in the heart of the Reach, on a world that was nothing but record halls and editing chambers stacked into a planet-sized library, the high editors of the Owlan Reach convened in emergency session. There were 40 of them, the oldest and most certain of all the Owlan, some of them 4,000 years old, keepers of the deepest founding records, the ones who had personally struck stars. They had ruled the Reach for so long that they had forgotten how to be afraid, because fear is a thing you feel when you might lose, and they had not been able to lose in 9,000 years. They did not understand what was happening. That was the most dangerous thing about them. They had been handed a problem entirely outside their experience, a thing that returned the deleted, and they reached for the only tool their long unbroken success had ever taught them. When the certainty lances of the survey wardens had failed, the high editors did not conclude that deletion did not work on the long memory. They concluded that the survey wardens had used too small a deletion. Their entire history told them that any problem could be solved by striking it hard enough, and they had never once, in 90 centuries, met a problem that proved them wrong, and so when they met one now they could not see it for what it was. They saw only a thing that had not yet been struck hard enough, and so they did exactly what the dead human ship had said they would do. They decided that the only answer to a thing that could not be deleted was more deletion, applied harder, with the greatest engine they possessed. They woke the consensus spire from its long rest, the system killer, the star striker, and they pointed it down the long dark gulf toward the place where the map said nothing was, and they prepared to fire the full agreed truth of 11,000 worlds at the long memory, exactly as it had told its witnesses they would. "They are coming," the ship said, and there was no fear in it at all. "Good. I have been waiting 10,000 years to be witnessed, and now I will be. Stay, Thelnos. Stay and watch them aim the spire. You will want to have seen this with your own eyes, because no one will believe you, and you will need to believe yourself." The consensus spire came out of the dark, like a moving wound in the stars, and it was the largest thing Thelnos had ever seen the Reach build, and it had been built for one purpose, which was to make large things stop existing. It was 9 kilometers of black lattice and white fire, a frame around an emptiness, and the emptiness was the business end, the aperture through which the Reach poured agreed truth at whatever it had decided was no longer permitted to be. It had struck 4 stars in its history. It had corrected the Halreth Combine, 12 worlds, in a single firing, and the Halreth were now a thing that had never been, except that their name was on the wall of the long memory, dated and kept, waiting its turn at the hearth. The spire was escorted by 240 editor cruisers, because the Reach did not believe the dead human ship was truly beyond deletion, and wanted overwhelming force in case it was wrong. The cruisers spread into a vast shell around the long memory at 100 kilometers. Certainty lances run out, and at their center, the spire turned its empty aperture toward the old gray hull and began to charge. Thelnos had served on the escort of a spire firing once, long ago, when the Reach had corrected a rival empire called the Halreth Combine. He remembered the way the spire drank certainty before it fired, pulling the agreed truth of distant worlds into itself, pooling 9,000 years of the Aeolan saying yes into a single overwhelming verdict. He remembered the Halreth worlds in the moment before they were struck, 12 of them, beautiful and alive and entirely unaware, and he remembered them not being struck, because that was the thing about a spire firing. There was no flash and no debris. The world simply stopped having been, and the part of the galaxy where they had hung healed shut without a mark, and the escort had flown home and Theln had eaten his rations and slept without dreaming. The Halreth Combine was on the wall of the long memory now, 12 worlds, dated, kept, waiting its turn at the hearth. Theln had helped to escort their deletion. He would, in 11 days, watch their return. He did not yet know that. He knew only that he was about to watch a spire fire again, and this time he was on the wrong side of it, and for the first time in his life, that was the right side to be on. Thelnos watched it from the hearth chamber through the ship's own eyes, which it shared with him freely, and he watched the high editor in command of the spire open a channel and broadcast the formal words of correction, the same words spoken before every striking in 9,000 years. "By the agreed truth of the Aulon Reach," the high editor said, "the object designated long memory is found to be an error. It is not in the record. It is therefore not real. The consensus does not recognize its existence. It is hereby corrected." "I have heard those words before," said the long memory, broadcasting back on the same open channel, so that all 240 cruisers heard it, so that the whole listening Reach heard it. "I have heard them 10,000 times. They were the last words 4 billion Velhans ever heard. They were the last words the children of Anuth would have heard, if I had not kept them. You have said them over so many graves, editor. Say them over me, then. I am the one grave you cannot fill." The spire fired. Theln Os had braced for light, for fury, for the great violence of a star killer at full power. There was none of that. The spire's firing was the most terrible thing he had ever seen, precisely because it was so quiet. The empty aperture simply became more empty, a deepening of nothing, and out of it came not a beam of energy, but a beam of agreement, the full pooled certainty of 11,000 worlds, focused and aimed, carrying a single message at a strength that had unmade stars. You are not real. You never were. Cease. It crossed the 100 kilometers in no time at all, because it was not a physical thing, it was a verdict, and it struck the long memory. And the long memory did not cease. Theln watched the verdict arrive and find nothing to act on. He had seen certainty lances fail against the bulkhead and had not understood it. Now he understood it, standing inside the thing as the full weight of his empire's truth poured over it, like water over stone. The long memory was not in the record. It had no founding entry. It was made, every plate and seam and etched name of it, from the memory of everything the Reach had thrown away, and you cannot tell the truth that it is a lie. The beam said you never were, and the long memory was the keeping of everything that was, and the two could not both be true, and only one of them was holding the full witnessed attention of 11,000 worlds. The beam failed. It did not gutter and stop, as the lances had. It rebounded. The long memory had told them it would, and it did, and the doing of it was the most exact and terrible thing Thelnos ever witnessed. The full agreed truth of 11,000 worlds, the verdict that said you are not real, reached the one thing it could not delete, and turned, carrying all its weight, and went back the way it came. It returned to the only place a fired verdict could return. It returned to the spire, and the spire was in the record. The spire had a founding entry. The spire was a thing the Aulon had built and named and entered into the consensus, a real and recognized object, and now its own full-power verdict arrived at its own aperture and told it, with the pooled certainty of 11,000 worlds, that it was not real, that it never was, that it should cease. And the spire, unlike the long memory, agreed. It had no choice. It was made of the record, and the record now said, in the spire's own voice, at the spire's own full strength, that the spire had never existed. There was no flash. There was no wreckage. The 9-kilometer star killer simply was not, and then the universe folded shut over the place where it had been, smooth and seamless, the way water closes over a dropped stone, and the 240 editor cruisers found themselves arrayed in a vast shell around an empty point of space where their greatest weapon had been a heartbeat before and now had never been. Thelnos heard, on the open channel, the High Editor begin to scream and then stop, because the High Editor had been aboard the spire, and the High Editor was in the record too, and the record now had a great deal of difficulty remembering that the High Editor had ever been born. It was the cleanness of it that Thelnos could never forget. He had braced his whole self for carnage, for a great roaring death, for the kind of violence that left wreckage and bodies and a scar in the sky that everyone could point to and grieve. There was none of it. The largest weapon his people had ever built, 9 kilometers of it, crewed by 140 of the most certain Aulon alive, simply stopped having existed, and the universe closed over the space so smoothly that within a heartbeat there was no evidence anything had ever been there at all. It was deletion. It was the exact thing the Reach did to others, done to the Reach, by the Reach, in the time it took to fire. The long memory had not killed the spire. The spire had killed itself, with its own truth, by aiming that truth at the one thing in the galaxy that could not be told it was unreal. The humans had not built a weapon that struck back. They had built a mirror, and they had simply held it up and let the Reach destroy itself in its own reflection. The long memory had still not fired a shot. "I told you," the old ship said, softly, on the open channel, to the 240 cruisers and the listening Reach beyond them. "I do not fight. I remember, and the thing about your weapons, the certainty lances and the spire and all of it, is that they only work on things that are in your record. You spent 9,000 years making sure everything you wanted to kill was first entered into the record so it could be struck from it. But your weapons are in the record too. Your fleet is in the record. Your editors are in the record. Your whole empire wrote itself down so that it could write others out, and now there is a thing in the dark that cannot be written out, and every time you aim your truth at me, it comes home." A pause. "I would stop if I were you. I would put down the lances and go very still, because I am tired, and I am old, and I have a great many names still to return, and I am no longer in a mood to be patient with people who keep handing me their own founding records to strike." The cruisers did not fire. Theln Oss watched 240 editor cruisers, the proud striking arm of an empire that had not lost a war in 9,000 years, hang motionless around an empty point of space, and not one of them ran out its lances, because every commander in that shell had just watched the consensus spire delete itself, and every one of them understood, the way you understand a cliff edge in the dark, that the weapon in their hands was a weapon that came home. There was a long silence on the open channel, and into it, the long memory spoke once more, and what it said was not aimed at the high editors, who were gone, nor at the empire, which was already falling. It was aimed at the 240 commanders themselves, the living ones, the ones with their fingers near the firing studs, and the sudden terrible knowledge of what those studs now did. "I know what you are feeling," the old ship said, gently, to 240 crews of the people who had built it nothing but graves. "You are feeling the floor leave. You believed one thing your whole lives, that the truth is whatever your people agree it is, and you have just watched that belief turn around and erase the largest thing you ever made. I am sorry for the size of it. I truly am. But understand what you have learned today, because it is the only thing worth carrying home. You did not lose a battle. You learned that there was never a battle to win, because the thing you called strength was only forgetting, and forgetting was never strength. It was a wound you mistook for a sword. Go home and tell them the wound is closing. Tell them it will hurt. Tell them it is the first honest thing your people have felt in 9,000 years. Withdraw," said the long memory gently. "Go home, tell them what you saw, and tell them that I am going to keep returning the worlds, one at a time, in the open, on every channel, until the wall is empty and every soul your people ever struck is alive again and remembered. You cannot stop me. You have already tried with the greatest thing you own, and you erased it yourselves. There is nothing left to send. Go home." They withdrew. Not all at once, and not in good order. Theln Oss watched the discipline of the Iolan Reach, 9,000 years of it, come apart in the space of a few minutes. A cruiser at the edge of the shell broke formation first, turning hard for home without waiting for a command, and then 3 more, and then the whole vast arrangement dissolved into a scattering of frightened ships, each making its own way back into the dark. These were the editor cruisers of the most certain empire the galaxy had ever known, and they fled from a 41-kilometer ship that had not so much as raised a weapon against them, because they had watched their own greatest power turn around in its tracks and erase the thing that fired it, and there is no discipline that survives the discovery that your sword cuts only toward your own hand. Theln Oss watched the editor cruisers turn, one by one, and fall back into the dark toward the heart of the Reach, and he watched the long memory do nothing to hinder them, fire nothing, chase nothing, exactly as it had said it would, and he understood at last the shape of the weapon the humans had built. It was not a thing that destroyed its enemies. It was a thing that handed its enemies the truth and let them destroy themselves on it. The Reach had built its whole power on the lie that the deleted were gone. The long memory had only to exist, openly, undeniably, to make the lie collapse, and an empire built on a lie cannot survive the truth being said out loud where everyone can hear it. "Ressa Vale," the ship said, and the pilot looked up. "There is a thing I want you to understand, because you knelt in front of the children of Anuth, and that tells me you are the one who will carry this. I am not your enemy. I never was. The humans who built me did not build me to conquer the Reach. They built me to make the Reach impossible. There is a difference, and your people will spend the next 1,000 years learning it. A conqueror takes your empire. I am only making it so that no one can ever again rule by deciding who gets to have been real. That is not a defeat. That is a door opening. Walk through it." Word of the spire spread faster than the long memory's own broadcasts, because the editor cruisers carried it home, and a thing that 240 crews have seen with their own eyes cannot be struck from the record fast enough to stop it spreading. The high editors tried. Theln Oss watched them try, on the open consensus traffic the ship shared with him. They issued a correction declaring that the spire had never existed, hoping to erase the memory of its destruction along with the memory of the weapon, and the correction failed in the most humiliating way possible, because the moment they struck the spire from the record, every Iolan who had watched it delete itself was left holding a memory of a weapon that the record now insisted had never been built, and the gap between the two screamed louder than any broadcast. The high editors could not even cover their own defeat, because covering it required deletion, and deletion was the very thing that had been proven to come home. They were a people who had only ever owned one tool, and the tool had turned in their hands, and now they could not so much as hide their wound without making it worse. Far away, the Reach was tearing itself apart, not with fleets, but with memory. World after world reappeared in the consensus. Crime after crime resurfaced in the minds of the living who had committed them. An empire that had ruled for 9,000 years on the comfort of forgetting was being made to remember everything, all at once, in the open, and it was discovering that it could not hold together under the weight of its own returned past. And the long memory, the last custodian ship of a dead people called human, lit its hearth again and turned to the next name on the endless wall and kept its promise. It took the long memory 18 days to empty the wall, and Theln Oss stayed aboard for all of it, because he could not make himself leave the only true thing he had ever stood inside. His barge crew stayed too. There was nowhere they wanted to go. The Reach they had served was coming apart behind them, and the thing it was coming apart into was not yet clear, and the only certainty left in the universe, the strange irony of it, was the old gray ship that the record said was not there. They watched the hearth burn through name after name. They watched worlds return. They learned, by the third day, to stop checking the consensus afterward, because the consensus always said the same thing, always with the same serene certainty, always insisting the returned world had been there all along, and the gap between what the record claimed and what they themselves remembered had become a kind of vertigo none of them could look at for long. On the 11th day, the long memory returned the Halreth Combine, 12 worlds, struck by the spire that no longer existed. Theln Oss watched the cold fire turn for 12 11-minute burns, one for each world, and at the end of it, 12 worlds that had never been were again, and the Reach's own historians woke with 12 worlds of memory they had not gone to sleep with. He had escorted the deletion of the Halreth long ago. He had told himself, all the years since, that he had felt nothing because there had been nothing to feel. 12 worlds of strangers, struck cleanly for some reason of state he had not needed to understand. Now he watched them come back, and he learned what he had actually felt at the time, which was nothing, and he learned what it cost a person to have felt nothing at a thing like that, and the cost arrived all at once, 11 days into the keeping, and Theln Oss, 240 years old, wept in the gray corridor of a dead people's ship for 12 worlds of strangers he had helped to murder and then declined to mourn. The ship let him weep. It did not comfort him. It had not been built to comfort the Owlan. It had been built to make them feel, at last, the thing they had spent 9,000 years arranging never to feel, and Theln Oss understood that the weeping was not a wound the ship had given him. It was a thing the ship had given back to him. It was the grief that should have been his all along, returned, the same way the worlds were returned, the same 11 minutes, the same exact care. The crew watched him weep and did not look away, and one by one, over the days that followed, each of them found their own deletion on the wall, their own vote, their own small share of some slaughter they had filed and forgotten, and each of them came at last to the same place Theln had reached, and the long memory returned to all of them, the grief the Reach had taught them to do without. It was the cruelest gift Theln Oss ever received. It was the only one that ever made him a person. On the 14th day, Ressa Vale asked the ship the question that had been building in all of them. "When the wall is empty," she said, "what will you do?" The long memory was quiet for a long moment. When it answered, the iron patience that had carried it through 10,000 years had gone soft around the edges, and Theln Oss heard, for the first time, how tired the old ship truly was. "I will rest," it said. "I have been awake for 10,000 years and asleep for the same, keeping. The humans who built me are gone. They did not survive what they learned about your people. They built 9 of us, and scattered us into the dark, and told us to keep, and to wait, and to return everything when the time was right, and a witness had come. 8 of my sisters are silent. I do not know if they failed, or finished, or simply ended. I am the last, and when the wall is empty I will have done the whole of what I was for, and there is a great deal of peace in that, more than your people have ever let themselves feel. You could stay, Resavale said, and Theln heard that she meant it. The reach is falling. We will need something true to build on. You are the truest thing in the galaxy. Stay. Help us. No, the ship said, kindly. That is exactly the thing I must not do. Listen to me, because this is the last lesson the humans left, and it is the most important one. The reach ruled by deciding what was real. If I stay, if I become the new keeper that everyone trusts, the new single voice of truth, then in 1,000 years I will be a new reach, and some new dead people will be building a ship to remember what I threw away. The answer to one voice deciding what is real is not a better voice. It is no single voice at all. It is many memories, kept by many hands, none of them able to delete the others. The humans understood this. It is why they did not build an empire to fight you. They built a memory, and then they died, so that no one could ever rule with it. I will finish the wall, and then I will go dark, and I will go somewhere none of you can find me, so that no one is ever tempted to make me into the thing I unmade. You will have to keep your own memory after this. All of you. Together. That is the whole point. That is the gift. On the 18th day, the long memory returned the last name on the wall. It was a small world, a single colony of 9,000, struck so long ago that not even the Reach's oldest records had carried a ghost of it, and the ship burned the hearth for it, the same 11 minutes it had burned for 4 billion, because to the long memory there was no difference in the worth of a soul, and Thelnos had learned by then that this was the deepest thing the humans had built into it. Every name 11 minutes, every soul the same, no correction worth more than another, the opposite, in every particle, of a people who had struck 4 billion as easily as 9,000, and felt the same tidy satisfaction either way. Thelnos kept the count, because someone had to, and because counting had stopped being a wall to hide behind and become a thing he did out of respect. 451,006 entries. 451,006 worlds, peoples, colonies, moons, and stations struck from the agreed truth of the Aulon Reach across 9,040 years, and returned, every one, across 18 days, by a single dead ship working at the steady patient rate of one soul honored at a time. He did the arithmetic the Reach had taught him, the arithmetic that turned slaughter into a number small enough to carry, and for the first time he ran it the other way. He did not divide the dead across the voices to make each share bearable. He multiplied. He let himself feel the full weight of 451,006, undivided, the way the long memory felt it, the way a thing that keeps must feel it, and the weight was unbearable, and he understood that it was supposed to be, and that a people who could bear it had agreed to stop being people a long time ago. When it was done, the wall was bare. 10,000 years of kept names returned to the universe, every one. The corridors of the long memory, which had been covered floor to ceiling in the record of everything the Aulon had thrown away, were gray and empty and clean, and the old ship was, for the first time in its long life, holding nothing. It is finished, the long memory said, and there was wonder in it, the wonder of a thing that has reached the end of the only purpose it ever had. Every soul is returned. Every world is remembered. The wall is empty. I am empty. A pause. It is a strange thing, to be empty after 10,000 years of being so full. I think this is what the humans wanted me to feel at the end. I think they wanted me to know it was done. Thelnos stood in the bare gray corridor and felt the weight of 240 years of faithful surveying, of votes cast, of corrections made, of a tidy ledger built on the deletion of the helpless, and he found that he could not put it down, and he understood that he was not meant to. The long memory had returned the worlds, and with them it had returned the guilt, and the guilt was the part the Aulon would have to carry forever, the part that would keep them honest, the part that would stop them ever again from believing that the deleted were gone and the killers were clean. "Go home now, Thelnos," the ship said. "Take your crew, take what you have seen. The Reach is becoming something new, and it will need people who stood inside me and understood, people who carry the memory and will not let it be deleted again. That is your work now, not surveying, keeping. You and your pilot and your crew, and the 240 cruiser commanders who watched their own weapon come home, and every Aulan who woke with a world in their memory that the record said was always there. You are all keepers now. You cannot help it. I have made you unable to forget. Go and be the thing your people never let themselves be. Go and remember." They went. Thelnos took the barge off the docking ring, and the umbilical port the ship had grown to fit them released them gently, and they fell back into the dark, and behind them the long memory grew small and gray and silent against the stars. He watched it go dark. It did not flee or fold or vanish the way the spire had vanished. It simply, slowly, went quiet. The lights along the great gray hull dimmed one by one. The faint warmth of it on his instruments cooled. The old human ship that had kept the names for 10,000 years and returned every one of them in 18 days powered down into the dark with the calm of a thing that has finished its work. And somewhere in the last of it, Thelnos thought he heard, on the open channel, in the old foreign tongue, a single quiet line that his engine rendered a half-second behind, soft and final and at peace. It said, "Keep them now. It is your turn." And then there was nothing on the channel, and nothing on his instruments, and when he turned the survey lamps back toward the place where the long memory had hung, the dark shape was gone. Not deleted, not struck, gone the way a thing goes when it chooses to, moved off into a gulf no Aulan would ever chart, to rest, to be the one ship the galaxy could never make into a master, exactly as a dead people had planned 10,000 years before. Thelnos queried his record for the volume of space where the long memory had been. The consensus answered with the serene total certainty it had always worn, the certainty he had trusted for 240 years, and it told him that nothing was there. The grid was clean, no mass, no metal, no name. And for the first time in his life, Thelnos looked at the record that said nothing was there, and he did not believe it, because he had stood inside the nothing, and the nothing had a name, and the name was long memory, and he would carry it until he died, and he would teach it to everyone he ever met, and they would teach it to their children, and no editor and no spire and no consensus would ever be able to strike it from the place it now lived, which was not in the record at all, but in the one place the Iolan had never thought to keep anything. It lived in memory, held by hands, refused to be forgotten. The Reach did not fall the way empires fall in stories, in a single day of fire. It came apart slowly, over years, as world after returned world remembered what had been done to it, and refused to be ruled by the people who had done it, and an empire that had ruled by deciding who got to have existed, found that it could not rule anyone who remembered being deleted and brought back. There were no battles, there was no fleet to defeat, there was only memory, spreading, kept now by 1 billion hands instead of one record, impossible to strike because there was no single founding entry left to find. The thing the humans had built was not a weapon that won a war. It was a truth that ended the possibility of that kind of war forever, and a galaxy that had lived 9,000 years under the shadow of deletion came out from under it, blinking, into a light it had forgotten was there. Thelnos lived another 400 years. He never surveyed again. He became a keeper, the first of a great many, and he spent the rest of his long life traveling the worlds the long memory had returned, telling the people of each one the true story of how they came back, so that the returning would itself never be forgotten. On a moon called Anuth, full of children who had never known they were once struck from existence, he stood before 40,000 of them in an open square and told them about an old gray ship that had kept their names in the dark for 10,000 years, and a pilot named Ressa Vale who had knelt in front of those names, and a custodian people called Human who had built a memory so perfect it could not be unmade, and then had died so that no one could ever rule with it. The children asked him where the ship was now. He told them the truth. he did not know. It had gone into a dark no one could chart, to rest, to never become a master. It might be anywhere. It might be everywhere. It might, somewhere out in the long gulf between the stars, still be listening, in case the galaxy ever forgot again, in case some new empire ever rose that believed it could decide who got to have been real. And if it did, he told them, the ship would wake, because that was what it was for. That was the whole of what it was for. Not to conquer, not to rule, only to remember, and to wait, and to return everything, the moment a witness came close enough to hear. He told them other things too, in the long years of his keeping. He told them that the Reach had not vanished, the way the worlds it struck had vanished, because the long memory had not wanted vengeance, and had built nothing to take it. The Aolan still lived. There were still 11,000 worlds of them, and they still spoke the old tongue, and many of them were the same individuals who had stood in the editing chambers and cast the votes. But they were not the Reach anymore, because the Reach had only ever been one thing, the agreement that the deleted were gone, and that agreement had died the day the worlds came back. What rose in its place did not have a name yet, in Theln's lifetime. It was only a people learning, slowly and painfully, and against every instinct 9,000 years had bred into them, how to remember. They built monuments now, the Aolan, the way the humans had. They marked the places where worlds had been struck, even the ones that had not yet been returned, because some founding records had been lost even to the long memory, and those worlds could not come back, and the new Aolan had decided that a world you cannot return is a world you must at least refuse to forget. They had learned the human word at last. They did not have a sound for it, but they had learned the thing it meant, and they taught it to their children, and the teaching went on. The children asked him if he was afraid of a ship like that, a ship that could undo whole empires. He thought about it for a long time, the way an old keeper thinks, the way an Aolan thinks now that the Aolan are allowed to remember what they have done. No, he told them, he was not afraid of it. The only people who needed to fear the long memory were the people who deleted others and called it clean. For everyone else, for the struck and the returned, and the children of Anuth, and every soul the Reach had ever thrown away into the dark, the old gray ship out in the gulf was not a thing to fear at all. It was the promise that you could not be unmade. It was the keeping of the names, and somewhere out in the dark it was resting, empty and at peace, the last custodian of a dead people who had loved the rest of the galaxy enough to remember it forever, and the children of Anuth, who were alive, who had always been alive, who would always be alive, went home that night and told their parents about the ship that kept the names, and the parents told their children, and the keeping went on, hand to hand, refusing to end, exactly as a dead people had meant it to, 10,000 years and a galaxy away.